It is the single reason that coordinate remote viewing exists and that it is taught as it is taught. The whole objective of that experience is to transform you. It is to remove the doubt. It is to remove belief and replace it with knowing.
You have wondered what you would be able to do if you were the ultimate version of you, right? You would then have an easy time creating what you want, and yes, effortlessly enjoying life too. Now, you may know this already, the influence you have over your reality is far beyond what you've been told. Soon, you realize that your outer world is merely a mirror of your inner world, and we're here to connect the dots for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to God Mode.
Welcome back to God Mode. Now, in this episode, we're for real going to talk about what the contents of the trainings are. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to continue on some of the fun, weird, strange topics, some high strangeness, as David would call it, or his colleagues. And we're going to talk about, well, you'll see. We're going to talk about some other stuff that I think it's important to explore. Now, let's dive right in, David, if that's okay with you. I want to ask you, what are the benefits of remote viewing or learning remote viewing? And then after that, I'd like to ask you, and I'll ask you then as well, what's the benefit of learning remote viewing with Upgrade, where we're baking in these accelerants to help people? I think this will be a new age of, and not like new age stuff, but this will be a new era of people being able to learn at an accelerated manner, at a deeper, more skillful manner, producing what we are expecting is far better results than ever. Would you tell us a bit of, just in general, what are the benefits?
That's a very challenging question to answer, because I teach, in the starting lineup of coordinate remote viewing, I teach it for a very specific reason. And how that, I know that objective will be met. I can, out of 30,000 plus students, the number of people who have actually walked away going, yeah, I didn't get any of that, are people who kind of came in with a preconceived notion of, I'm really just here to, I don't believe it and I don't believe it can happen, so I'm just here to prove that to myself.
Wow, there are people that go there.
Oh, yes, of course there are.
They just go there to prove that they can't do more.
Yeah.
How idiotic.
Yeah, but it is true. There are people who, look, you start off with this old study that I reference to people all the time, happened back in the very early 80s or late 70s. CNN did a poll. Why CNN did this poll, I'm not really sure, but they did a poll and they actually published it. It was in an airline magazine, and I happened to read it on an airline, and it had to do with this. They asked this question of 2,000 respondents: how many of you believe in something beyond the physical? Just a simple question. They didn't say God or heaven or something else. Just how many of you believe that there is something beyond the physical? Out of the 2,000, the percentage was 98% said, we believe there's something beyond the physical. 2% of those respondents said, we do not believe that there was something beyond the physical. The 2% that did not believe it are then cut out of the pool. And the 98% who said they did were asked the second question. How many of you believe, since you believe there's something beyond the physical, how many of you believe that it is something that you can interact with, that you can contribute to, that you can learn from, that you can realize on a day-to-day basis that you're connected to that in some way? This is where it gets interesting, and it speaks to where we are within the human condition and where we are in how we see ourselves and how we see our potential to interact with the world and those around us. 76% of those asked that second question came back and said, yes, we believe in something beyond the physical, but no, I do not believe that I will ever realize it, that I will ever interact with it, contribute to it, learn from it, and it will never be a part of my reality.
Is that counting Wi-Fi?
The 24% said, yeah, maybe, not giving up hope with it. So of that 24%, I used to think that that's the target audience, is the 24%, which gives you a pretty small audience. It actually isn't the target. The target is the 76% who are lost, who believe that there's something beyond the physical, but don't believe that they will ever reach it. If you see where that shakes out in the world for them, the churches that they belong to, that they go to every Sunday, that they pay their tithing to or what have you, but they just don't believe that it's real. They're not going to walk out on it because they want their kids to be there or they want to be there with their wife and
Traditions.
Exactly. So when we look at that statistic and then you start asking yourself, why? What I found was that's exactly where I was. As a high priest in the Mormon church, I was exactly there. I was one of the 76%.
Wow.
I believed that there was something beyond the physical, but I had absolutely no evidence, right? I had no evidence. I was perfectly willing to stand up to the pulpit, and I was perfectly willing to say everything I had been taught to say, right? But I felt myself a hypocrite because I didn't receive revelation. I didn't communicate with God. I didn't, I tried to have this testimony, but at the same time, I questioned everything. I had no evidence. I had no empirical evidence. I didn't have anything that I could touch. I didn't have anything that I could hear or see. And so it was easy for me to just keep saying, yeah, I'm part of that 76% because I believe that there's something beyond the physical, but I do not believe that not in my lifetime, not here, now, I'm ever going to be able to realize that.
And you were a high priest before you joined the remote viewing unit, or?
I was a high priest before I was recruited into it, yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What a trip.
Very trip. Yeah, very much so. I mean, I can remember funny stories like when my wife at the time, Debbie, and I were first married. I remember, because we were college students and we were going to visit her parents, and I had this Mustang, and that was the car. And as trying to save gas, where you turn your car off and coast down the mountain to try to save gas. Well, my dumb ass didn't realize that it's Wyoming. It's like 30 degrees outside. You're up high on the mountain and you turn your car off and head down. Well, it causes an ice block in the fuel line or something of that ilk, right? So when I get down to the bottom and I try to start the car, it won't start. It just won't start. And I still remember Debbie looking over at me and saying, use your priesthood. I said, what? You want me to lay hands onto the car and make the car start? See, I just couldn't. Now maybe I know that people within the faith would say, well, that's because you had no faith. So you can't do things like that if you have no faith. But anytime I gave a blessing or did something like that, there was always this voice in the back of my head going, what are you doing?
Interesting.
This person is dying of cancer or something else. You're not healing them. Why do you think you have the ability to do that? Now,
we can talk about that. There's a very interesting.
I have a different perspective now.
Yeah.
But in those days, that was my perspective. And so then
I could tell. I could tell you're different about what you're thinking about it back then.
But
now
that's what we're going to talk about. This is the lead into why remote viewing is important, right?
Yeah.
Entering the training, coming out of Royal Cape, the activity, right? Being recruited into Sunstreak as the first, special operations combat
And
arms
Sunstreak
officer.
is, for the audience,
The remote viewing unit. It's known by a couple different names, Grill
Stargate
Flame.
was one of them.
Well, that was its final name,
Oh.
as far as I know. So the final name was Stargate. Those are code names for those that don't know. So you have a special access program, top secret special access program. It means that, there are limited people who are supposed to know what goes on there. They have code names for them. So Grill Flame, they're always two words. Grill Flame, they're supposed to be computer generated, but they sometimes just don't sound like it. I would think that, if it were computer generated purely, it might end up being like dying cockroach or something like that, but it's always cool stuff, right? Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, Stargate, Grand Tour Shadow, stuff like that. And they're supposed to change those code names every so often. Like, I don't know what the rule book is. I'm not an intelligence officer, but I think it's like every year, maximum of 2 years. The idea is you don't want to let people outside the special access program start to associate names and faces and ranks and locations
Makes
and
sense.
intelligence product with that code name. So
Makes
you
total
change
sense.
it again. Right.
Yeah.
So when I was recruited into Sunstreak, I started the training program there. And because I consider myself a scientist and very much a pragmatist, and you already know, even as a high priest, I really wasn't buying into that for myself. Oh. And so also remember at Royal Cape, where I came from there, that was the place where I realized that they were taking kids that had been recruited into Royal Cape who were not LDS.
And explain to the listeners what LDS are. Basically, the Mormons that you're
they're
talking
Mormons. It's Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm.
And so this organization was actually recruiting young soldiers that they were bringing in, putting through selection, meaning to select them, have them qualify to serve in Royal Cape, which was an organization that was responsible for supporting clandestine and covert military operations in Tier 1 and Tier 2 countries. Bringing them in, and with the church being Whitting, the first presidency of the church, sending these kids, who I understood were not even LDS, sending them to Provo to go through the Missionary Training Center, sending them through the Language Training Center, essentially pushing them through the temple to take out their endowments, and then sending them into various countries to serve as proselytizing LDS missionaries, which the entire function, which you served mission, the entire function of that is to proselytize to non-members, to baptize non-members, and to bring them into the church.
How did you find out the first?
I was the deputy executive officer at Royal Cape, and I had to brief John O. Marsh Jr., the Secretary of the Army at the time, on every movement that organization made. The organization got in some trouble with John O. Marsh Jr. years earlier, or a year earlier, where he told them not to go somewhere, and they did. So then he drew a circle 50 miles outside of the Pentagon and said, anytime you move anybody in your organization outside this 50-mile radius circle, you will only do that with a written signed order by me. So I had to go bring these orders to him, brief him on the whomever it was. It could be any one of the operatives, it could be support personnel, it could be anything. But I had to get those orders signed by John O. Marsh Jr., brief him, get him to sign. So I briefed him like 3-4 times a week on these things.
Wow.
Some weeks. I became aware of this operation by doing just that. And when I saw it, because I always had to go through this kind of a staff action control book, right, where I had all the orders lined.
Interesting.
And had big, giant 5-inch 3-ring binders that I had to carry around all the time when I was in the Pentagon. I would go and I saw that, and I went back into the skiff and found the lieutenant colonel, who was, by the way, LDS, who kind of brainstormed this thing, created this thing, and then got the church's permission to do this. And I just railed because I thought this was in violation of everything that I thought it was supposed to be. No separation of church and state. How could you possibly do that? I remember at BYU, my roommate used to tell me, Dave Chesworth, he used to say to me that, hey, on my mission in Peru or wherever it was that he was down there in South America, he said, it was horrible because they always thought we were CIA. And I thought, well, there you go, you know.
Interesting.
Now it kind of clicked. Well, sure, they would think that. I thought it was just that way because they were walking around with
black
shirt,
suits or suits.
Suits and, yeah, or just white shirts and ties and other things, and they look like agents. So that's what everybody there thought they were. Now we kind of know why maybe that was. I don't know how long this program was going on. I just happened to get wind of it within my first 9 months of being there. But what I did do is I really questioned the lieutenant colonel because I was just off-put by the whole thing. I mean, really upset by it.
Interesting.
And I went to Colonel Tony Lackey, who was the commander of the organization, and he knew about it. But, you know, he's not LDS, so he's not.
Is there
offended
a
by it.
possibility that much of the leaderships that might be involved in the church didn't know in that church?
No, but you'll never know because what I asked is the first presidency Whitting of this, and he said, yes, this was Lieutenant Colonel.
Oh, interesting.
So I fired off a letter to the first presidency identifying myself as a high priest and having been in a bishopric and in a stake presidency.
No one's going to respond to that.
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. It's like that would be like sending a letter into the CIA and asking that because if they respond to it, then they either confirm or deny it, which means that they are witting of it, right?
Well, they probably get 1 million letters with how many members there are, so they probably don't even go through most of them.
Somebody has to open them and look at it.
Oh.
I mean, they don't just throw them all in the waste can when they come in there, right? They open them and somebody opens them and reads them. And if somebody opened it and read that, right, that I work in a classified special access program and I am aware that you're doing this, you know, I would like an explanation as a high priest. And you get no response. So like 6 months later, like a dumbass, I send off a second later with the first one attached, you know, referencing
You were expecting
it.
a response.
Yeah, I'm in my naivete. Yeah, I really was. I thought, but then I was new to the intel world, right? I really didn't know all the subtle nuances of, you know, the shell games that went on with stuff like this. So,
And you had a certain expectation that the church would be separated from state. And I'm not saying they are or they're not. I'm neutral or not attached to either of the ideas.
yeah. Well, I was. I mean, I was.
tell.
I mean, the things that kind of drove that for me were like, I remember at BYU that there was this big kerfuffle going on with landlords, because you know when you are there, you have to sign an honor code that you will abide by, and it has certain restrictions about where you can stay if you're not staying in, you know, in like Hinckley Hall or some other place. If you're not in a dorm,
You got to abide by.
yeah, you can't have co-ed apartments and those kinds of things. It's not it wasn't allowed. And everybody signed the honor code to be there, to go to school at this really fine university. And the president of the university was Dowlin Oaks.
Oh,
I still
wow.
remember him. He was one of those kind of people you looked up to, right? Just his demeanor, his posture, his wisdom. He was a good guy. Well, Dallin Oaks is there, and there's all this stuff in the newspaper, which I seldom read because I was very busy with studies and ROTC and everything else. But there was a big fight ongoing because the church had gone to a bunch of these apartment complexes there and said, you cannot do what you're doing. You're allowing co-ed habitation here, and it is forbidden for the students to be capable of doing it. So we're going to put your apartments off limits. We're going to tell the students they cannot live there, which means they'll vacate or we'll suspend them from the university. So a lot of people were shocked by that, and you can imagine people were on both sides of the fence with that. But these apartment owners got the federal government involved. And this is what I love.
Interesting.
The federal government comes to Dallin Oaks and to the church and says, hey, you have no right to put down this kind of a law and to penalize these property owners because of how they're filling, the apartments. You have no right to do that. In fact, we're going to cut off all your federal funding if you don't release your lawsuit and, make these places available for living. And I still remember the response in the paper from both the First Presidency and Dallin Oaks. We don't take any federal money for this school. This school is entirely funded by its membership. So what's your next position? Like that. Eventually, the property owners did exactly what they wanted because they weren't going to win that. And the federal government had no leverage over the school because we don't take any of your money.
Money talks.
You can tell the University of Utah that, or some other place, but you can't tell us that. So they are off limits until they restructure how they're putting students in there, right?
Yeah.
So I liked that. That felt good to me that, hey, this is self-contained.
Justice was always in your veins. I could tell that you care about doing things right.
I guess, yeah. It's not that I haven't been a troublemaker in a big part of my life.
Hey,
as a kid,
part
I
of the
could get
journey.
in trouble, in the blink of an eye. Good student, but still in trouble. I went. So when I'm seeing this, I am just beside myself. Of course, when I sent the second letter off, that was totally ignored as well because I sent a third letter asking to be excommunicated. They didn't do that either because had they done that, it would have been what? Acknowledgement of the request based on the grounds that I had listed. So it was just ignored. Probably a good thing. I mean, I'm not active in the church, obviously, anymore. I still don't even know how they find me, but they find you. It's really freaking scary.
It's easy. They just have a book that talks about all the members that live in the area.
Yeah, but how do they know that? See, that's the whole deal. I pick up and move from Las Vegas to Florida in Lakewood Ranch, and all of a sudden here's a knock at the door, and you walk over, there's two missionaries staying there, Brother Morehouse. I'm like, God, how'd you track my ass down again? So it's funny that they do it. I don't know how, but it happens. That was what I was happy to get out of Royal Cape. And go over to this other place, the remote viewing unit. And it was the point at which I just pulled the plug and just never had anything to do with the church again after that. And you said you were neutral, and that's the same thing I found. I was asked to come back into places like Cedar City in the years that, like in the 90s, and do radio shows like after the book came out, and I would tell these people, like these fireside chats, and I would tell them with the same way in which I'm telling it here. And they would just look at me like, so? If that's how they want them to serve, so? I was like, I guess, I was totally a fish out of water, missing the entire point of all of that. So it's okay. Now, the truth is, I don't single that church out for that and for that being the only culprit because when
you can only imagine how many other religions and churches. That's why certain governments are so cautious about Christian church entering.
Well, the Catholic Church is really big
I can
into
only
these things.
imagine.
I happened to go when we were fighting in El Salvador. My general took me, who later became a 4-star general, Fred Warner. I went with him and I stayed at Ambassador Dean Hinton's house, who at the time was the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador. Married to the president of El Salvador's daughter. I mean,
Interesting.
he looked like he was 70 and she looked like she was 35.
Oh, wow. Even more. Okay.
Well, if you're the president of El Salvador, and you want to make sure that the U.S. keeps you in mind and is there to support you against the communist guerrillas that are waging war in the hill country around
yeah, it
everything,
makes sense. Political.
around San Salvador and in San Salvador, you offer up your daughter to that. That's how I saw it. But I happened to be, as a young lieutenant, sitting there in a meeting where I'm watching the ambassador, Dean Hinton, I'm watching my general, I'm watching the Mill Group commander, who's a lieutenant colonel or a colonel at that time, who's responsible for coordinating all the U.S. military efforts in the country, in the embassy.
As you're saying this, may I pause and say to the audience something very important?
Sure.
Because what you're sharing with me is almost like a back row access to seeing the answer completely, not just in a linear way. Because when we ask the question of why is it important for people to learn remote viewing and why is this going to benefit them, some people might be listening and they're not completely linearly on track of understanding it. But in my mind, not only do I appreciate this, but I'm seeing David is sharing the non-linear answer, which requires someone to be willing to open their mind. And I think it's really for intelligent individuals to be able to do this. So I'm simply saying, if you're really intelligent, you will actually understand why David is explaining all of the non-linear from history to background stories and jumping around timelines and explaining different parts. It's like a spiral. And the spiral gives you complete understanding of how important this is. Because if we gave you a linear answer, you might not even be the right person in this training. In fact, if you got it, that's great. But we want you to know non-linearly, and of course we'll give you the linear answer at some point, why is remote viewing going to not only give you a unique set of skills, but it will make you who you really are. It will give you tools that you only dreamt of, but realize it's not a dream and that you can possess. Please keep going. I love hearing this.
Thank you for that. I have a tendency to answer in context, meaning that there, as you said, there's a web of things that lead to, the point of this story, and I can only answer it from my experience, and then we can extrapolate beyond there for what I know the experience of others will be. But
And I know our audience want to hear this and listen carefully, because these people are listening to, literally the title is God Mode, Win or Win More. This is not a linear podcast.
No, not at all.
And we want people to, these are smart people who can handle non-linear answers. Now, I can't say about other podcasts who people listen to that their audience might be like, well, this is awesome information, but what's the linear answer? I'm interested in exploring the non-linear because the context gives people, because so many times when you ask a phenomenal master a question, they don't give you a linear answer. If you just got a linear answer, you're typically not talking to a real master. And they're not speaking to everyone. They're speaking to the people who are ready. So the nonlinear answer gives you not just content, it gives you context, which is so important. And most people miss the context. They only go for the content. But those are the impatient individuals who,
especially if you spend most of your time on TikTok and Instagram and
it's
Twitter.
the short. Hey, give me 30 seconds of what's going on.
Exactly. Get it to me in 2 sentences. Well, that'll never happen with me, because if I do that, you will miss the texture of why I made certain decisions with this right?
Yeah.
And that's important for everyone to understand leading up to it. So back to this story,
Yes.
because I'm a young infantry officer and I am now with the chief of station, who is the CIA representative in the embassy, the ambassador, the mill group commander, my general, and the cardinal of this particular area. So the cardinal is there, right in there with the rest of them in the fray of this thing, and what they're doing is strategizing how they are going to essentially, let's call it what it is, proposition and manipulate various members of the president of El Salvador's cabinet, leading up to them getting a decision which favors what they're trying to do from the president of El Salvador. So in other words, instead of just going up and handing him a document, or, Dean Hinton walking up and, with a cocktail in his hand and saying, here's what I want you to do tomorrow, it's an entire ballet of how this is going to happen. And it was a huge eye-opener for me to understand that
needs to be orchestrated.
this goes on, that this is the world. This is what's happening, that we do this to world leaders. We have everything from
What year was
religious. It was in very early 80s, before Grenada, so 82.
There's
we were
a
fighting
great
in El
book
Salvador.
on this, the economic hitman, right? Is it even? Is it? Oh, well, keep going.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
It was just stunning to me to see that and to understand what I was now being privy to as a young officer. I can tell you that just doesn't happen. There had to be a reason why these things were being seeded into my psyche, that I happened to be seeing these things.
Wow.
Because it does not happen. I can tell you there would never have been another infantry lieutenant sitting in a country team meeting like that, listening to them strategize who was going to walk up to who, at what time, what they liked to drink, what they were going to say to them. They were going to bring them a drink, right? Here, let me freshen that up for you. What they were going to say, what little tidbits of things they were going to seed into the conversation to beget a certain response. And then the next person would come up into it. All of these guys, players and this orchestra, going to do this. It was frightening, disappointing, and fascinating to see all of that.
Wow.
Right? So I was there for probably a week watching this kind of stuff.
And you were in El Salvador.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Watching this all unfold night after night, meeting after meeting, a party here and a party there. That's one thing that happens in embassies, lots of parties. So one night it'd be at the embassy, the next night it would be someplace else, or, at a palace or some other thing. It's just that my head was being filled with things that were well outside the scope of what I thought I'd ever be doing as an infantry officer, as a paratrooper, as a Ranger company commander, as an airborne company commander, et cetera, airborne battalion commander. It was eye-opening. And it was changing me by seeing those things. Still, because of where I was in my career at that point, I was still completely locked into that's just the way things go. And I will follow any order given to me so long as it is a legal order. Under the law of land warfare or otherwise, I will do. That's who I am, and that's what I'll do. I'm a good soldier, so that's what I'll do. So now I find myself coming through Royal Cape with all the big discoveries there, and I've now gone through being, an airborne rifle platoon leader, a weapons platoon leader, an airborne rifle company commander for 2 years, and an airborne ranger company commander 2 years. And I cycle out of that, and I'm in Royal Cape, and then from Royal Cape over to Sunstreak. And when I get into Sunstreak, the biggest disappointment to me, I think, because I was a trainer, a consummate trainer in the military, is there was no program of instruction.
Sunstreak is the remote viewing program.
It is the remote viewing program. There was no program of instruction. There was absolutely no training outline, and there was no manual, which that's just unheard of in the military. but this wasn't really the military, but it was the military. Everyone else in that organization had come from someplace in the intelligence community, and everyone in the organization had some previous notion or claim of clairvoyance, okay? That's how they all got there. I never made that claim. I never talked about ESP or anything associated with that. It was not in my lexicon to talk about something like that.
May I ask this real quick? Because I noticed, and I remember in a previous conversation, I think you mentioned something about Dean Radin reaching out, or was that something that happened?
No, I just happened to be in Las Vegas during a book conference, and Dean Radin was over at UNLV, and he was testing, and so I got thrown into the mix of one of his tests. It was herding, digital ducks around on a computer screen and some other things just like that. And I don't know if I did well or not. I mean,
because he's a researcher in the parapsychological research community.
He researches a lot of amazing things. He's been around a long time.
Yeah, I've actually listened to his book, The Real Magic.
Yeah.
Well written.
Yeah. He's a smart guy.
Please keep going.
Sure. So I'm a little frustrated because it's not a good training program. And I would think by now it would be a good training program.
How many years was that already in
Well,
place?
it started in circa 78, 79, and now I'm there in 86, 87. So...
Wow. And prior to that, they were developing it at 72, right? 1972?
Well, that was at Stanford Research Institute.
Got it.
In Palo Alto.
6 years later, they started the program.
Well, remember, I think we talked about this in one of the other episodes, but in 1970, there were human intelligence sources, unconfirmed. I've never been able to track down any kind of documentation that verifies this. So it is hearsay, but the hearsay was that in 1970, thereabouts, human intelligence sources indicated that the Chinese and the Russians, the Soviet and the Chinese, and some others were heavily involved in the study of the paranormal. They were looking for clairvoyance, and they were looking for really young ones.
Interesting.
Allegedly, so they could bring them in and groom them and train them.
Weren't the Germans and the British and possibly...
It's alleged, but I don't know if they were. Again, this is just hearsay. Nobody's ever been able to confirm it, and it's what I will tell you it didn't come out of this recently discovered trove of Nazi documents that dealt with an organization that answered to Himmler, that people are trying to associate with the occult. I've read all those documents, those that have been translated anyway, and they're broken down into 4 basic categories. And these are letters back and forth between members of this organization, and this organization was not occultish, and I'll explain to you why, but it had... one of them one of the first, categories of letters dealt with them as part of their Aryan effort to establish their origins and the origins of their language and where it had evolved. They were trying to do that. They were trying to build a map that said, here are all the places where we started and we need to, as we capture
the German
Europe.
language.
Yes.
Oh.
And the whole heritage of where they began. They were trying to do that because Hitler and Himmler and others, you saw parades and they're in the parades wearing the kind of stuff that they wore back in the Middle Ages and other things. They're doing it because they're trying to resurrect this attachment to the Aryan race and to the Aryan mythology and Wagner and all these other things. So that is one category of those letters. And if you read those letters, which I did and put a synopsis together, it's just them bantering back and forth about who's going to be responsible for this and who's going to be responsible for that. and where they're going to go here and where they can't, why they can't go there yet, and etc. Totally innocuous, totally just them trying to track the Aryan roots. The second set is they're expanding it into Britain and Ireland and Scotland and trying to look for roots because of what was going on back in the early days, right, with Saxon and fighting with Vikings and all of that kind of thing. They were trying to track roots in there.
Using remote viewing type technique?
No, not using remote viewing. I'm telling you, there was an allegation recently made by a woman in a book. She was a runner-up for a Pulitzer, so she's no dummy. And her name is Annie Jacobson, I believe. And she wrote a book called Phenomenon. And in there, she alleges that that these documents there is a letter in there that became the promulgating document that started this psychic arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, it doesn't exist there. And that's why I'm telling you I read those, because I want people to understand that I completely disagree respectfully with her finding, because you're going to have to show me the letter, because I can't find it. So the other category was called the Norwegian project. So in the Norwegian project, it is, that Norway was occupied by the Nazis. The Norwegians hated the Nazis, and they're trying to, at the behest of Himmler, establish some sort of a scientific research partnership in Norway. And it's letters back and forth between the curator of this organization and between the director of this organization, trying to get Norwegian leaders and scientists to support them in the scientific study and evaluation, again, linked back to their Aryan heritage and where it came from. And the Norwegians want nothing to do with it. Now, the third category that I skipped over, I just gave you the first, the second, and the fourth. The third category was called the Dowsing Project.
Oh.
Now, in the Dowsing Project,
interesting.
The Nazis were working on the concept of dowsing. Oh. They had individuals that purported to be dowsers, to be sensitive to that. They had recommendations for the right kinds of metals for dowsing rods. They were into the whole thing of training dowsers and finding dowsers and determining what they were going to use it for. They were going to use it for economics, for trying to find precious metals, trying to find strategic metals, oil, right? Those kinds of things. And then they had some crazy wild hair, long-reaching things where they were going to use it militarily, which it didn't delve into that, but use it militarily and politically and economically. Dowsers. So that was there. Plus you had dowsers, dowsing rods. You had astrology was placed in the mix with all of this, and pendulum work. And that's what they were working on. But that is as occult as this organization got. In fact, in the letters, you can read that the state police, secret police, there was an organization that had a director that was responsible for propaganda and some other term about taking care of the people. I apologize for not knowing it. It's been a while, but in this, you read how the Nazi organizations that were monitoring all this stuff, they were going after anybody that was practicing the occult. They were going after them and arresting them and putting them in prison. And if they found dowsers or people with pendulums anywhere near these places where they made these busts and arrested people, they confiscated all their literature, all their books, all their records on everything, including all their dowsing rods, their pendulums, and anything else. And they put them in prison. And Himmler, trying to keep somebody between him and the problem, was using the director of this organization and the curator to write these letters to these different organizations, not signed by Himmler, but signed by this director and his right-hand man, trying to get the dowsers released, to which these other organizations, Nazi organizations, were like, no, no, you won't. And they made them actually vet their dowsing books and would only release certain books. So it was a really tight control over what was happening in terms of the occult. There's a really good book, if you're interested. It's called the Nazism, the Occult Roots of Nazism. And I forgot the name of the author, but the Occult Roots of Nazism is probably one of the definitive works that will lay all this out for you and explain it. It was not like what we thought it was. Like popular lore is. It was misunderstood and grossly under-researched is what it really is about Nazism and the occult. So that's a good book to look at. So that did not start this. What it appears started it was simply human intel that came back in the 70s and said the Chinese and the Soviets are doing this. And, oh, yeah, maybe other people. If they're doing it, we have to assume anybody else is doing it. And that is what caused the director of the CIA to get Robert Gottlieb, who was the guy that ran the MK Ultra program, and said, do we have any kinds of programs that are doing this kind of thing? Doing what? That are using human beings to see something remote in space-time and to collect intel information on the same and bring it back. Are we doing that? No. Well, then I think we should do that. So that is when they put out a contract. They request for proposals, and I'm sure any of the research agencies that were there, SAIC, Pear Labs, SRI International, which was not part of Stanford. It used to be, but not now. I think they broke off in 1970. And they gave Stanford Research Institute International a sole source contract. Now, if you know anything about
$50 million or something?
Well, look, it's the CIA. It's their sole source contract, and they put out into the public that it was $20 million. Nothing happens for $20 million in government contracting. Nothing. So if the CIA is telling you 20, you can probably 10x that.
Oh, wow.
Or at least 5x it, okay? Even back then. So they get a sole source contract, and they have 3 primary deliverables in the contract, because I read it. And in the contract, first deliverable is we need you to scientifically validate that human beings can be clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, right? Validate that scientifically, that ESP is a real thing in human beings. No hocus pocus, no sleight of hand, no tricks. It is or it isn't. We don't care one way or the other. Because if they came back and said, and this is the beauty that anybody that's wanting to learn this or even exploring this, you have to understand the significance of this, because all of the skeptics out there who want to say this ability does not exist, Stanford Research Institute International, under contract to the CIA, with laser physicists, not some schmoes they hired out of somewhere to come in and do this, right? Laser physicists and mathematicians and psychologists, psychiatrists, and anybody else they needed to bring in. It was part of the team. At its peak, 18 people, I understand. They came in and ran their tests and collected their data and evaluated their data and came back and said, we have scientifically proven that the ability exists in human beings. The CIA did not accept that, which they never would. They're experts at keeping somebody between them and the problem, and thereby, minimizing risk to them. So they brought in auditors. I believe it was Pear Labs and SAIC, who had their own paranormal research areas, one from Princeton, the other SAIC, a Beltway Bandit kind of thing. And they came in and looked at SRI Internationals. They looked at their science. And their job was to find flaws in it or find if there was researcher bias or anything. And the response back was, it's good. There are some things that could be corrected, but, minor corrections. Science is good. Okay. So next deliverable is, can you tell us who is capable of doing this? Who will be good at this? I mean, how do we know where to go into the population and scrape people out and bring them in and shape them and mold them in the way we want them to be so we can use them as spies like the Chinese and the Soviets are doing? And again, this is something that people should pay attention to. What was said by Targ et al. Was this. We have determined that this ability exists in everyone. You do not have to have a spiritual or an emotional or a physical trauma. You don't have to be, some unique individual, get zinged in the head by a bullet or have a heart attack or something else. Everyone has this
Normal,
ability.
healthy, any type of individual.
Everyone is born with this. All you have to have, as they qualified, is the willingness to step forward and learn.
Wow. Step forward and learn.
Yeah. So two very powerful things. You see, if a skeptic had any leg to stand on in all of this, you could have had 3 of the top research labs in the United States come forward and go, we have all concluded that it's total bullshit. It does not exist, and it never will exist, and it never did exist. But instead, it was the opposite, completely the opposite. That has to be one of the most poignant things. But of course, the skeptics, most of whom were mentalists and stage magicians themselves, especially in psychops, all of them, think that any ability that comes from this realm has to be assigned an illusion and a trickery. Why? Because that defined their life for so many years, right? So they think if you're able to do something like that, well, they're in their mind, what they're doing is working on how they would conduct that illusion. And so they will then show the world, well, I can do that because I've developed this trick to do it, without giving any thought to the fact that the individual is actually doing it. It hasn't got anything to do, because your world is based on a foundation of illusion, right, that you earned your living with for decades. And then you went to school to become a psychologist. And so now you can distill down every human ability to an illusion or a trick because you're so smart. It's just preposterous that they do that. So they don't get as much traction as they used to, but only if you adhere to the rules we talked about earlier for remote viewing. Otherwise, they will come for you and they will set you up. Dumbasses get set up all the time with this.
Oh, I'm sure.
All the time. So the third deliverable, and this is another important thing, was can you develop a training program for this? Okay, now you're telling us everybody's got it, so we need a training program to replicate this. Failed miserably at this, because why?
They're research scientists.
They're research scientists. They don't know shit about doing a military training program. So one of the original research subjects, the guy who coined the term remote viewing, didn't come from SRI, came from Ingo Swann. Ingo Swann had a 7-stage dogma, a protocol. He invented it. He created it. It has, over the years, been improved upon, restructured slightly, some pieces dropped off, other pieces added to. But that is what was taken and taught. Ingo taught it to the original members of the unit. I'm a little bit perplexed about how he taught it, because some of them, like he told me, one person that he only trained to stage 3. He said, because for me to try to take him any further would be a waste of my time, because he was fighting it all the time. So he just left him at stage 3 of a 7-stage program. But now I found out that many of my other colleagues that were there were only trained to stage 3. So now I don't know if that, and they were trained by Ingo, I don't know if they fell into the same category as the other guy. But I do know that Gabrielle Pettingale was trained in all 6 stages. They dropped the 7th stage off early on. That was called the phonetic stage. I know that Mel Riley was trained in all 6 stages. I know I was trained in all 6 stages. I don't know if Lynn Buchanan was trained in all 6 stages. I can't remember.
Are any of the other 6-stage trained individuals alive or no?
Gabrielle has passed. Mel Riley has passed. Ed Dames is somewhere in the world. I think he's down in Uruguay, somebody told me now.
Oh.
And I'm alive. So I was trained in that. All the rest of them, I don't know if Joe McMonagle was trained in all 6 stages or if Skip Atwater was trained in all 6 stages. I can tell you that, when you get there the first day, they tell you, they open up the file safe, and it's the historical safe. And it has everything to do with the discovery of remote viewing and what they think the Soviets are doing or the Chinese are doing. They didn't call it remote viewing. They called it other things. So, but you're asked to read all that. And then in the years that I was there, which were 3 years, I read everything in those filing cabinets because...
What do you do when there's no target to view?
Exactly. I mean, you can't, there was no internet to surf. I mean, that didn't exist then.
So you were serving the other version of the internet.
Yeah, the existing files. And I was finding out what everybody in that organization did. I saw all their training targets, all their operational targets, yes, everything. So you could see all of that and look through it all. So I know what everybody did there, and I also know what they didn't do. And the thing I want to point out to the listeners here is that here's what I've said for decades now. Absolutely, I know everything that all of us did there. And I know that because of morphic resonance, I know this. I know that viewers we train now are better than any of us ever were. Many of my former colleagues balk at that, but that's just because ego is there. I know, I've seen what students do now. It's astounding. If they listen and they learn and they let go of the preconceived notions about some other thing that they have, and they're not going to fight you on what you're asking them to do. You're telling them to leave what they think they know already at the door and just listen and learn, because you're going to be given the science. You're going to be given the physics behind this. You're going to be given explanations for why it works and how it works and how you're able to do what you're going to be asked to do. You're also going to be given quantifiable, measurable feedback, so that the data that you derive, that you perceive, both visual and verbal, you're going to be able to bounce off of known quantifiable attributes so you can establish an empirical accuracy rate in your data. You're given video feedback. You're given hard copy feedback with links and historical sketches, everything, to make sure that we codify the learning process and close the loop for you in every target. Why is that important? And what happens to you? You can come into this and fight, like I did. You can be skeptical, and I did. But you can't fight for very long, because what starts to happen is you start to see, especially learning in a group, you start to see, number one, what you're doing and the volume of data that you are gleaning from 2 sets of 4 numbers where you are blind to what is happening, and you're going to see what everybody else in the class produces, because that's how it unfolds. And eventually, along about day 3, you have already lost the ground that allows you to talk yourself out of what you're doing. And when that happens, soon as you realize that the sheer volume of data and the accuracy of the data not only from you, but from all your classmates, you now know that you don't believe that there's something beyond the physical. You don't believe that you might be able to interact with it. You will know that there is something beyond the physical, and you will know that you interact with it, that you contribute to it, that you learn from it, and that you always have, and that you never were not able to do it. You just didn't know how to listen. And now you'll be seeing the world through entirely different eyes, and you will be sensing the world entirely differently. And exactly how that will translate to each person outside of what I'm already telling you is as unique to each person as anything else, right? Some people, it's overwhelming. Other people, it's like, wow, Other people will just sit there and go, well, damn.
This is like flow to me. I remember my first experience. You gave us a 8-digit number. You didn't tell us anything. And I remember sitting in that room in Toronto when you were doing that training that I first attended. I remember closing my eyes after going into an altered state that you share with us. And I remember seeing things. At first it was really blurry, and I'm like, I'm not sure what this is. Am I psyching myself out? Am I imagining things? And that's the thing, right? A lot of people see things in their mind, hear things, feel things, but they just deem it as their own thoughts or noise or whatever, distractions. But we learn to identify what those are, and we learn to basically put that data on a piece of paper and sift through them ourselves, right? And I remember drawing this horseshoe shape, and I saw water and trees and buildings, and I thought, I'm making stuff up in my head. Now, being as open-minded as I was still thinking that I got to be making stuff up. And then I look over, and I see everyone I saw drew something similar. And I'm like, what the heck, right? Even though I was already a believer, now I couldn't deny it. And that was the first day, right?
Yeah.
And then you revealed to us. Should I share with the audience?
Sure, because it'll all be different targets.
Perfect. The target was Niagara Falls, Horseshoe Falls. Of course that looked like a horseshoe, right? Of course there was water. Of course there were buildings and trees. And I remember you walking over, you're like, yeah, that looks about right. And I'm like, really? And I was like, wow, that made the cold Toronto worth it, right?
Yeah.
For me to be there. And I could only imagine. And here's something I noticed. It was really easy to get rid of the noise in my head. And I could tell if I had taken that training prior to developing what we do here at Upgrade, that would have been really difficult. Because I remember when I was younger, in my early 20s or mid 20s or in my teenage years or any time before, I found myself going towards every distracting thought, everything that could get a hold of my mind's attention. Whereas it was easy to say, nope, yes, nope, yes. It was really easy because I didn't have emotional charge towards things I used to fear, things I used to feel angry about, things I used to feel depressed about or anxious about or doubt. I was just in a neutral position. I wasn't getting pulled easily by everything. And so that made my experience phenomenal, right? And I couldn't stop thinking about it, frankly, from that day on. And here we are talking about this.
Yeah. It is the single reason that coordinate remote viewing exists and that it is taught as it is taught. The whole objective of that experience is to transform you. It is to remove the doubt. It is to remove belief and replace it with knowing, because that's the most powerful thing you can have, and that's the most powerful way to move forward in your life of unlimited promise and possibility, is that knowing that you are this omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, eternal being, that you were placed here for a reason. You were endowed with these gifts for a reason, And the whole issue as we move on in all of that is exploring together as a group as we get to the next level and the next level and the next level is, why do we think that whatever brought us here, from wherever we came, why do we think that these gifts were bestowed upon us?
That brings up an interesting question, because some of the folks out there that might be listening, whether they're spiritual, not spiritual, religious or not, they and especially the religious folks, they might be like, are we supposed to learn these gifts?
Clearly. If not, I mean, if you believe that you were created by God or whatever you conjure in your mind, if you believe that, and these gifts belong to all of us, it goes back to just the words that I just said, omnipotent,
Why would we not
omniscient,
develop it?
omnipresent. Those were words that were created long before the King James Version of the Bible was put together. Those were words that were put together. They emanate out of Greek, but they then became ancient to ancient Latin, and they were being used to describe attributes of the spiritual, of humanity, of man, not, man and woman, not of a deity. I mean, in the discussion I had with Rob, yesterday, his attachment was to these things were attached to deities, but that's not absolutely established. They were being used to define attributes of highly spiritual individuals, not necessarily gods or a god or a deity. Now they've been stolen from us. They've been taken from humanity, and they have been applied to a deity and you are told then throughout all your life that you cannot aspire to those things. You cannot aspire to those things. Those are not attributes that belong to you. They are attributes that belong to something that you must accept on a basis of faith, sight unseen, and you must aspire to that and to that message, to the message from that. When what I want you to understand is, I'm not saying you're gods. I'm saying that those were the words that were used to describe us. We were given these gifts.
What a powerful programming tool to say to someone, that's not part of who you are, it's part of something else. Because by removing that from someone's identity, it limits their behavior and their perceived skill sets that they have innately, which causes them to not even consider developing it.
Right.
Which, that's like telling someone that who actually is born with the identity or the ability to fly, but telling them their whole life they couldn't, and that's impossible.
And then further complicate that in their mind by saying, if you do aspire to these things or think that these are attributed to you, then there's a special place where you will go, where you will burn eternally, or you will not be entered into the kingdom of heaven or to the celestial kingdom or any of those kinds of things. So you will have violated the rules as they are established in these organized religions that say you cannot be these things.
Sounds like archaeologists that we were just talking about.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, who
It
decides
does.
whether these belongs to human or not, right?
Well, organized religion did. That's who decides, because they had to have something to describe something that could be set apart from humankind, from mankind, right?
Which, because we're on this topic, and I know that you don't mind me bringing this up, and it's an interesting topic. Even though we're talking about the benefits of why they need to study remote viewing, is to explore their true potential, right? And these are just doorways into one of many other skills that they could possess that humanity has largely they haven't even looked into it except specific few, right? What I'm curious is your thoughts on this concept. And there are two words I looked into. They are One of them is ancient Greek. It's the word egregore, which I'll tell you the definition from Wikipedia. We'll take it for what it's worth, right? It's an esoteric concept representing a non-physical entity or thought form that arises from the collective thoughts and emotions of a distinct group of individuals. Now, I know this is completely off topic, but since we've been talking about everything from aliens to, the ranches in the Southwest of America, all the way to, all of these interesting, weird topics, I figured, I'd love to hear your takes on it. And I don't expect any absolute answers. I just thought if we're talking about God, and I'm not denying or accepting, because I'm taking a neutral position in this podcast, I want to have an exploration on, if humans can think and identify a specific identity and assign that to a being that we call deity or anything, and to many this may sound like blasphemy, but I need to ask this because theoretically, if someone assigns a set of attributes to a non-physical being, whether they actually exist or not in the beginning, with enough people attributing specific attributes or assigning specific attributes to this non-physical being, the theory based on this ancient Greek word is that we can actually, using our human energy, conjure and or create a specific thought form, and that this energy can be sufficient enough over enough time and large enough population and create a specific entity outside of the physical realm and behave with the characteristics of that specific design or set of attributes.
There's another interpretation for that refers to it's essentially if there are a body of people that are focusing in those attributes and compounding those, there is a process of conjuring.
Literally, that word.
Conjuring an entity, an esoteric, non-embodied entity. So that would be probably much like somebody engaged in channeling, which channeling is, in my opinion, extraordinarily dangerous and probably not common, because a channeling, I'll tell you, I had dinner with Jay-Z Knight back in the day. She's the woman that she channels Ramtha, which was at that time a 35,000-year-old entity, is what she said. She's made millions doing it. She used to have about 35,000 followers, maybe more.
Wow.
And I think that's dwindled down now considerably. But she's been very successful in doing this. Her ex-husband claims that she fakes it and has a script, and that's what ex-husbands you would expect to do.
Right.
I spent time with her, and I found her to be a very interesting woman. But I also saw what I saw when she became Ramtha, So her idea in this, or her definition to me, was that a channeler projects outward to look for the type of entity that they want
That already sounds dangerous.
to bring in, right?
That already sounds like dangerous.
And then allows that entity to come into them.
That sounds even worse.
Absolutely. Come into them and speak through them.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
And that allegedly, it always has to be taken to another level, which is where your physical features change and your voice changes and that kind of stuff, which, look at my face. I don't buy that, but I do buy that you can ask yourself to be possessed and take your chances.
Yeah, don't do that. Our audience, please.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
I've always told people I've never experienced that, and don't be ridiculous. Don't ask for that, because how do you know what's going to show up? If you believe that there is something beyond the physical and that you can interact with it, contribute to it, and learn
And
from
you've
it.
literally had encounters when you were in altered states, right? During some of the missions in the unit.
Well, yeah, it's inevitable that something like that will happen. And when you get into things like some of the more advanced forms of the phenomenon, then you have to be conscious of the fact that being in a prolonged, altered state of consciousness, where you're not consciously aware of what you're doing. So you're in a theta brainwave state or theta delta, and you're flipping back and forth there. That if you're in these targets, we choose
Carefully.
how carefully where we're sending you. But it doesn't mean that there's not something clinging on or there, or something that might try to intercept. And I don't want people to think this is crazy weird. It's not. You have to remember, when we were doing targets in the unit, we were looking at a rogues gallery of targets. And we're spies. And we're in a realm that could have other spies like us, but there's also other traffic out there. And so if you're there bouncing around doing what we're doing, it would be ridiculous to think that you could not at some point bump into something that you really didn't want to bump into, or that it might try to find you for some reason. I mean, not everything out there is positive and not everything out there is negative. The important thing that we impress upon students is nothing there has the power or the ability to influence you that you don't allow it. You have no right or responsibility to bring anything back with you. You are there to do work. You are there to learn the protocols of extended remote viewing, or when you go to the next place, or whatever aspect of it you're learning next. You're learning advanced techniques. You're going to put new tools in your tool bag. That's the whole point with these things. But you have to understand the makeup of the universe. There's positive and there's negative and everything in between. In these non-physical realms, there's positive and there's negative and there's everything in between. And much of it, you have no experience Rolodex. You have no experience database to be able to detect it, decode it into a four-dimensional language, right? Four-dimensional lexicon based on your experience. So some of these things become disconcerting or confusing. Your biological brain will decode it as fast as it can into something that it's comfortable with or that it has a reference for and go here. And then you're putting it down. But in some of these, like extended remote viewing, where you're not sitting at a table detecting, decoding, and objectifying, you're flying. And when you're flying, you're in a more vulnerable state. But we give you the tools to
be safe,
to protect you from that with your intention, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So if you are ever frightened by something that you experience out there, or feel like you have been, challenged, it's because you invited it, and we want to make that perfectly clear in those.
Now,
things.
that's the cool thing about the accelerants that we're going to put in in Upgrade, because wouldn't you agree that many people who have negative emotions, negative charge, and that's an electromagnetic, like a electromagnetic type of field that are attached to them in a sense.
It's the same thing as walking through this physical life. I mean, if you are a person that's thinking and vibrating in that way,
that's attracting.
A criminal walking on the other side of the street looking for a target, they find you, okay? So it's no different just walking through this life. There are criminals that what they do is they learn to sense their targets, and they learn where there's weakness and where there's potential to
upgrade the mind.
It's what every great combatant master teaches, those things, right? About situational awareness, preparedness, strength of mind, strength of focus, strength of presence, strength of all these things. What you're teaching, it's what I will teach in remote viewing as well. You cannot assume that just because now you're going into an altered brainwave state.
So we teach a model now because we're building these different new updates for Upgrade, right? And we're adding an accelerant because I've been meditating as we're talking over these nights. I'm like, okay, what can I add? And I have specific accelerants I'm going to pull from the Upgrade OS training or other trainings within our catalog. And one of which is a scanning device, which is, not a actual physical device, but we built the scanning device to allow us to scan vulnerability within our minds,
Yeah.
which then we remove by resolution, removing those negative charge, which I suspect, theoretically, I think it would work. It would put the person in a far more fortified, protected state when they go into these different altered states. And frankly, people go into altered states without us teaching them, unprotected.
Going into these altered brainwave states or these various brainwave states are something you do every night. Every night you go from gamma, beta, alpha, theta, delta, ultra deep, and you come back up again, right? You get up to go pee, you come back up, you go do your business, you come back and back down again you go. So, we talked about this when we get into thought incubation and stuff like that, and even in extended remote viewing, that's why so much of the lecture is about the power of intention,
So important.
observer,
There's like
evaluator.
mathematics that you teach about the moment and the intention and all that stuff.
Right. And that's taught so that coming into this, before you get into the dogma of coordinate remote viewing, because coordinate remote viewing exists for a purpose.
It's like using a camera, but you learn how to use the camera to see the target, right? Coordinate remote viewing. And then extended remote viewing, it's like you're flying to the target, see it in your own eyes. Is that accurate?
Coordinate remote viewing is detect, decode, objectify. Extended remote viewing, in coordinate remote viewing, you have the structure of the page that you've learned and shown, and it's
incredible.
It has
protocol.
all of its rules. It is, isn't it?
I loved it.
It's a wonder. I mean, it's just hard to believe that one human being like Ingo, came up with that. It's brilliant, and
it's a standard operating procedure of how to pass through the portal into the 8th dimensional hyperspace. Literally, those are the words, right?
Right. Well,
beautiful.
We detect and decode. We detect in 8-dimensional hyperspace. Also, a better way to explain that is a holographic matrix field. And so, if I say that, people don't really know what that means. So first, you have to understand what a hologram is. So I'm going to show you what a hologram is. I'm going to show you how a hologram gets made. And I'm going to show you what makes that so unique when you have a holographic plate now that has the waveform expression of everything in the image that you're looking for, and why you can break that plate now and take the smallest piece of it and still send the reference beam through it, and it will project the hologram on the outside of it. That's because that waveform expression of that image is omnipresent through that holographic plate. So when you then consider a holographic matrix field, that being the more than just the universe, because remember yesterday we were talking about the quantum foam of space-time, and that the theory amongst theoretical quantum physicists that as is the micro, so is the macro.
As above, so below, right?
And we gave that example saying that, you can think of it as the universe as being one bubble in all the bubbles that you see on the foam on a head of beer, and they all connect. They're all stuck together. So
they're one of the same foam.
Back on. Well, the idea is yes, but the idea is that it's that many universes.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
That many.
I see. Yeah.
Universes, because we don't know how many there are, and it's not the many worlds theory. That's totally different. It's the idea that we don't know how many there are, but we theorize that these points of singularity that we talk about are simply like possibly an event horizon, like from a wormhole that consumes matter and light and energy on one side and pushes it through something, through the event horizon into something else. The speculation is if it's consuming it, if it's pulling matter in and energy in, consuming light
destroyed.
itself, where's it putting it? So if it's pushing it into another universe, then but we don't know that. It's just Everything in quantum mechanical physics is interpretations. It's interpretations. And the greatest physicists, the Temple Award winner, any of them, they'll all tell you that we have what we have, and we have the mathematical proofs to support what we have. But it could be bullshit tomorrow. And they will look right at you and tell you that. The greatest of them will say, it could all be bullshit tomorrow. Why? Because we might learn something else tonight, and that changes the variable, which changes the entire equation, which changes everything we thought we knew. And now we have to look at an entirely new way of looking at that, right? And I like that. It means that everything in quantum physics is an interpretation based on what we know now. That's the right way to look at that. There are no absolutes. And the best physicists will tell you that anytime anyone in science starts to speak in terms of absolutes, that they have overstepped their bounds as a scientist. Nothing is absolute. Not even a statement that there are no absolutes is absolutes, right? You cannot adopt it. It's all an interpretation based on what we know now. So it is appropriate for us to borrow from quantum mechanical interpretations and to apply them into the interpretations of quantum mind. It is appropriate for us to do that because it gives us answers. Over here, the theories and the experimentation and the mathematical proofs and the understanding of those interpretations as they are help us understand the functioning of our quantum mind. Without it, then you're expected to accept it because I say you can do it, or because some starry-eyed New Age guru in a back room with a beaded curtain has said it is so. And that does not transform. That becomes an anecdotal experience, and people accept that and embrace it, but that's not what we're going to do. It's not what you do in Upgrade. It's not what we do in the remote viewing portion of Upgrade. And you're going to be constantly using these accelerants to bring people back, right? To anchor, to reinforce, to do those things, and also constantly telling what's next and what's next in level 6 and 7, et cetera, as we get through 7 levels of remote viewing.
I believe this can be what we call a X factor, how we work together, because a lot of people may not realize this, but to put it simply, if we have a quantum mind, right, and we're taught to think binarily, like yes or no, right or wrong, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm simply saying that is the binary limitation where there are only 2 states. But if it's quantum in nature, that's at least 4 states, at least, if not more than that, infinite combination of states. So if the human mind's naturally quantum, we put a binary operating system on it, that's not only a waste of resource, a waste of our mind, but it's a severe limitation of what the human mind can do. And I think, this is my guess, this is my speculation, that the greatest way to imprison a being is to give it an operating system that does not illustrate the actual capabilities, and that it will think that's the limitation because it's a software limitation. It's like putting a software of driving a slow Honda Civic on a Ferrari F8. And the Ferrari F8 thinks it's a Honda Civic and has 190 horsepower, while it has 800 horsepower. And I think that most humans are literally living that life. And now with your help, we can scientifically prove, other than what we do in the rest of Upgrade, where we help people improve their life and see it, what we're interested in is now we can, in our classroom setting, show to them what they need to see to understand that they're far more capable right then and there. Now that is insanely powerful. That to me is insanely powerful. And so I think that let's take a break and come back and talk more about why it's important and what is actually happening in the different levels of remote viewing.
Yeah, let's talk about the other levels.
I think you guys need to hear this, and we'll come back, tune into the next episode, because we're going to be talking about the what and and the how, and then a little bit more of the why, this is going to benefit you. Talk soon.